Well, we are here together with a very distinguished panel. My name is Mirabile. I was in the previous session and thinking about and reflecting about my own experience. 20 years or so. For my sins, I have worked in policy positions. And this is why perhaps for those sins I have been chosen to moderate this session. But this panel is very distinguished. We're going to talk about our experiences. The holy trinity for this session is systems, innovations, and policy. So we're trying to bring the three things together. And this is a co-creation process. We'll try to speak as less as possible and then have your perspectives also. So may I start by requesting my distinguished panelists to take 1 minute each to introduce themselves. Can I start with you?
Sure.
Mariana.
Hi everyone, many thanks Nabil. So my name is Mariana Mirabile. I'm an economist and statistician by training, and I have worked most of my career in international organizations. I'm currently at the OECD working on climate change policy issues. And what mobilizes me is really what worries me is the extent to which we are currently killing life, let's say, and destabilizing the climate. So that's why I work on this area, and I see a lot of potential on systems innovation for helping us address some of those problems.
Fantastic. Great to see there's something which mobilizes you and kills you at the same time. Great. Good stuff.
Thank you, Nabil. My name is Cristian Matti. I'm originally from Argentina. I have been working on climate change and territorial development. I mostly work on innovation policy. I recently joined the European Commission. I'm a policy analyst in the Competence Center for Foresight. So I'm supposed to help people to think about the future, especially policymakers. But during the last 7 years, I have been working in the EIT Climate Kick, supporting member states to develop different policies in the ground, cities, regions, and national level, especially in terms of cross-ministerial and cross-functional groups. And that's kind of my motivation to try to understand how we can create this kind of cross-functional type of setting.
Fantastic. Well, welcome. And for you, Cristian, so everything which I have here comes from Argentina, which is all the great beef that you have, and also dulce de leche.
Pleasure to share the panel with the two of Argentinian heritage. My name is Jesper Christensen. I'm a humble Danish person here, an anthropologist as training. I come to this conversation with experience from redesigning policy inside government in a place called Mind Lab in the Danish Innovation Lab. I've been working several years at Nesta, the UK Innovation Fund, trying to build a curriculum for capacity building and culture change in government. I don't know if we were successful, but we spun out as an NGO a couple of years ago called States of Change, which is a global innovation learning collective that is essentially trying to partner with governments to push them into a more transformational journey. Of recent, we've redistributed that leadership, which made it possible for me to join a foundation called the Kuchen Foundation. And here I'm eager to continue that journey and maybe push government from the outside with other sorts of resources which we can get into in the conversation. My main indignation is, I think it's outrageous what governments are getting away with in terms of intervening in people's lives, both around the knowledge and intelligence they use and the processes that they go about doing so, which I think in both cases needs fundamental rethink.
Fantastic, Jesper. So mobilization, cool, something which is outrageous. We're going to have some interesting conversation. At a quick count, it's 20 of us, and I was thinking if the average experience in this room is 15, then it will be close to 300 years of experience that we have in this particular room. So I'm expecting a very interesting conversation. Now, 3 stories here, which we're going to hear, and 3 streams, 3 perspectives. So let's start with these stories first, trying to understand, okay, what is being done, in depth. What is the kind of change which they're anticipating and then we'll take it from there. So, Mariana, if I would request you in 4 minutes or so, if you could tell us your fascinating story. Over to you.
Many thanks. So you would like to hear what I'm currently doing at the OECD, trying to bring about kind of systems innovation in policymaking?
Absolutely.
Yes, many thanks for that. So we're trying, as I mentioned, I'm working on climate change policy, and we're trying to facilitate the use of systemic tools so that policymakers can think about policies differently to what they do today. If you look at climate action today, most climate actions will try to do the same thing a little bit better, let's say. It will try to improve parts in systems that are unsustainable by design. We're trying to shift policymakers' attention from parts to systems functioning so that we can transition towards systems that function better rather than just bad systems with slightly better parts, right? Mm-hmm. For that, we have developed a process. One of the barriers, one of the, let's say, the good news is that a lot of people in governments see the need to do things differently. The issue is that they do not know how. They don't know where to start from. And that is where we have put together this process, which has 3 steps. I will explain it in a nutshell, where we are trying to facilitate the use of system thinking by a little bit putting systemic tools in boxes at the end of the day, because these steps are containers for systemic tools. Sometimes we get into the number of systemic tools, we don't know which one to use when, etc. So it's trying to bring some order to that. The process is a 3-step process. We are encouraging policymakers to envision the results they would like to get from systems. What do well-functioning systems look like? To then understand why our current systems do not look like that, through systems dynamics in particular, and to then identify which policies can help us redesign systems so that we move from the systems we have now that are not working properly to the systems we would like to get to. We have mainly worked on the transport sector, and we're currently working on the residential sector, and we are doing that through system dynamics analysis, and we're using and also via workshops with stakeholders where we are trying to really launch a process where policymakers can test the systemic tools, and systemic tools may be as simple as the iceberg model, but those tools, from our experience, are helping really to foster different discussions and to shift the attention and hopefully in the future policy priorities. Maybe I'll add something.
No, thank you very much. If I could ask one question, because that's related to your introduction. What's your frustration with this particular process? What's killing you? What's not working?
My frustration is that it's still too small scale. I think these workshops, this type of analysis should be happening more. So I would say the small scale. Overall, I have a fairly positive experience. However, because every time we have done this, the reaction has been very, very positive. Even much more positive than what we often expect. In policy making, we're not very effusive. We're not very, and it has been really, really positive so far. That's all.
Okay. I'll call you for that. I'll come back to it because at the beginning you said that you're trying to make things a little bit better. So perhaps we're aiming. Our aim is too low for that. Okay, that's my comment for now. And I want to be a little bit provocative so that you start thinking about it. Cristian, over to you. The cool things which you're doing in the European Union and your rich experience from Argentina, which you bring to the table.
Well, we will leave Argentina aside.
Okay.
That's much better. So I'm going to tell you, I hope in 4 minutes, a small story about time, transformative change, and innovation in public policy that involve actually my current organization, the Change Research Center, and my previous organization. Now you see, again, a little bit of my job career. So many years ago, in 2018, we put together 50 people in Slovenia from 7 different countries. 13 of them were policymakers, and the rest were companies, universities, and also research institutions. And the key question was how we address climate change in a systemic way. And we discussed about cities and district, climate adaptation, Industry 4.0, now a circular economy, and this kind of topics. From that first experience, also there were people from the commission and from other organizations there, we start to discuss about how these topics need to be addressed in an interministerial way, but also in a systemic way. Right after the meeting, we got the invitation of several policymakers to start a conversation. From that conversation, the first initiative was launched in Slovenia to start talking with 3 ministries, then with 5, and then with 9. That was 2018. Now there are 12 programs across ministerials designed with companies, industry, and community building to transform Slovenia from the circular economy point of view. The other case was Bulgaria, Cyprus, Malta, and many other countries that are there. The process to get in there took a long time. As I mentioned, Slovenia, 3 ministries, then 5, then 9, convincing, putting people together. So you can start with a workshop, you can start with ideation, but then you need to move to other type of activities and process to get people together. But that pay off, okay? So that is the kind of the transformation that can lead to policy innovation in the future. And if you want to know more, in the afternoon, I'm presenting the handbook that compiled all this in the summer, a little bit of marketing. So
fantastic, yes, and especially finishing at a marketing pitch for your next session. That's great, I like it. So what's the most exciting part? You know, now apparently you have said that this diversity of people you brought together, and then you got the attention of policymakers, and now you're able to expand beyond Slovenia to other countries. So what's the most exciting part of it?
I think there is a kind of a sense of awareness about, especially with practical topics like circular economy, that you need to address the value change, is that it's not about being inclusive because we are a nice society, it's because of the risk of failure. If you do not have the right people in the process, you have a big risk of failing, okay? Because you need to have all the actors who bring this transformation. So I think getting into this kind of very practical sense and not this kind of storytelling, no, we need to be all part of this, otherwise the transformation is not going to happen. And the banks, the industry are going to lose a lot of money. That is, I think, the kind of the attractive element that I see, that you can use this kind of raw reality to mobilize people.
Fantastic. Jesper, over to you, your story.
Yes, thank you. I'm thinking of, in a way, what the core question has been driving the journey that I've been on, and it is very fundamentally about, how do we create the common good, how do we create an inclusive society. Certainly in Denmark, there's a significant rhetoric about, the people's school, the people's employment centers, and that's the emphasis for everything we do. And yet we have a systematic reproduction of a system that excludes the same group of people over and over again. So it's really hard to live with. And then there's the question of, when we talk about systems change, what are the levers we can start to pull? What are the things that we can go to? And I'm going to mention 3 things that sort of made sense for me to focus on. One was at MindLab, and really addressing this this need for getting the citizens' voice into decision making, and sort of providing a core reference point and a more closer relationship between decision makers and citizens. And that was very much what we were doing at MindLab, trying to, with different sets of methods, bring in that voice and work with that systematically to get. We talked about creating professional empathy among decision makers, and for that, in that way, kind of changing the premise or the foundation of the process and so on. That only got us so far in terms of redesigning policy. I think we got the bureaucracy involved in a good way, but when it came to actually involving the political level, it's like a sacred thing. You can't really touch that. And so if you're doing redesign of policies, but you're not influencing the political envisioning and the scoping of the policies, there's only so much you can do. So the second step I took was to get involved in sort of more social policy, bottom-up co-design. So I did a couple of different secondments in Canada and Australia, working with mental health and mental disability, working with housing issues, vulnerable families, and so on. Very much trying to co-design services from the bottom up, something that made a lot of sense on the local level, and we even got to kind of some proof of concepts, prototypes, and implemented services, particularly in Canada, quite successfully, but only on the local level. And then there was the question of, could we begin to convene and curate a bit of a bottom-up movement of community organizations pushing for a systems change from the bottom up, both through collective learning, both through collective advocacy procedures, and through, let's say, tactical conversations and so on. And again, I think there was a limited impact when it came to actually really embedding these new system logics that otherwise made a lot of sense for the people we were trying to serve. So the third step was then going to Nest and saying, well, seeing those experiences, we need to have better ownership at a leadership level, whether that's provincial government, whether that's national government, or even local government. So this reason of focusing on the capacity side, on what does it mean to take ownership of leading in uncertainty, leading with complex issues, all of those elements, and what does the curriculum for beginning to put people on that learning journey, whether you are executive leader or kind of more regular policymaker. So a lot of years partnering with various governments, and again getting to getting some way, I think, in terms of providing, particularly providing a different emphasis on culture change as an importance. So, and you know, there's obviously innovation is often perceived as a set of methods or techniques, and you can go on a 2-day course and then you can come back and implement it, as opposed to doing a 2 or 3 kind of learning journey, investing in your own personal transformation, both organizationally and your team and so on. So we try to really support that. And again, I think seeing how this theory of change about investing in people and the HR component essentially was why that was meaningful. You could also see someone mentioned that earlier in terms of the turnover, in terms of the other conditions that are involved in government, and the limitations that ultimately had for what we were trying to achieve. So we had pockets of good results, but also a lot of feelings of unfulfilled potential. So to put that all together, and what I'm trying to do now in this new position is to, in a way, do all of those 3 at the same time. So we're trying to cultivate the promising practices from the bottom up that are we work in the social services system. There's a lot of good promising stuff happening. How can we begin to mobilize that in sort of a social R&D movement? How can that become a policy platform? At the same time, how can we push and work strategically to rethink the reform agenda? So it's about taking different ownership, it's about experimentation, it's about learning and all of that stuff. And then the third element is to then kind of work directly with decision makers to kind of take the implications into policy, the actual policy process, and think differently about the dynamic between policy and practice and so on. So that's where I am now. That's sort of what I'm setting out to do. But I have tons of questions and uncertainties about the journey ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. You're a brave man, I must say, when you took up this task. Changing governments is not easy. I recall Labour, who said that bureaucracies are like that iron cage, and inclusion is a tough cookie anyway. But tell me, in your journey, things seem to be working. You know, you're moving forward. What's the outrageous part of it?
What's the what?
Outrageous. I'm using your word. What's the outrageous part?
I remember a conversation with the middle manager from the Ministry of Finance in Denmark, and I was outraged by the worldview that this person came in with, to say that it was all about maintaining control. It was all about pretending that we could think things through, create a plan, and then we give it to someone else to implement. And then, because we've done such a good job of devising the plan and describing it, we had all the possibility in the world to blame the municipalities for not implementing well enough. So from the get-go, this was this sort of us and them dynamic about it. So in a way, it was the opposite of taking collective responsibility for the issue we're trying to deal with, in this case, education services. And that was actually, after that meeting, I quit my job at MindLab because I had had those experiences so many times in terms of that sort of the opposite of taking ownership of the issue, and particularly with the Minister of Finance that's sitting on the budget. So for me, that's what I think is outrageous, that we are still seeing those logics, and it's been the same outputs, the same reproduced outcome. So that's where I'm coming from on that. It's not that I'm particularly critical of particular professions, even though I think you can make some connections around that. But I think it's more about, we have a very narrow professionalism when it comes to the culture of decision making. We need to expand that with other kinds of knowledge, other kinds of ways of dealing with the process of change.
Right. Well, I go back to Mariana's beautiful point, which she made. I think that's perhaps the wisdom of having a low ambition level, because all of us, we think in silos. So tinkering with these silos and moving up step by step, perhaps is the way in your case, Mariana. Now, I'm going to pose a question to three of you before I move from panel to people, right? So participants here. So that will give you some time to think about it, before I talk to participants. You have heard these stories from your co-panelists. If you were in their shoes, what would you do better? So this is a hard question. So this is first a test of whether you're only telling your own story or listening to others. Putting on the spot. Secondly, trying to understand, because if we are going to learn from each other and co-create, we have to put ourselves in those shoes. So how would you do better, for example? And I've given you a cue by saying, you are playing with the Ministry of Finance. They are stuck and saying, okay, this is my job. I have done my job and I've given it to the local government. I'm done, right? You're trying to tinker with these silos, which are there. So what will you advise to Jasper? Having said that, as I indicated earlier, we have 300 years of experience here, and I don't want to monopolize these questions. So if you have a question after this one, raise your hand. If your question that you think is a burning question, raise your two hands. And if I ignore you, then please stand up, but don't yell at me. So it's your choice. Who wants to start first?
I started the other two, so I would say, why don't you?
Okay. I will be the next one. So I was particularly triggered by your experience with the Ministry of Finance, because it happens to me that meetings ministries of finance, but not in the Nordic countries. Okay, you might be more lucky than other countries like in the south of the east of Europe. So I think the issue about being so well organized and being able to implement have this kind of double value. Okay, you know that you can do that and you can achieve that. But many ministries of finance are not even able to implement the budget because of the lack of capacity of the system. So I just wonder if there is no need, for example, because I have been working also with Nordic countries, if there is this kind of intermediation role of someone that with enough power and convincing elements that can bring a narrative on top of the Ministry of Finance, that can be actually the army of supporters that can convince that guy. Because that happens to me several times in countries that are not well organized, but are politically more strict, okay, especially in the East. So you really need to have a kind of an intermediator broker at a kind of a more even high level, but also with some reputation about having a good storyline to go with it, to break the point. That would be kind of my approach based on my experience in other countries.
Yes.
Should I respond to that or advise?
Both.
Both. It makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is how do you then, what that mediation look like in creating a better political debate or a more outcomes focused political debate. And right now we have these very kind of conservative forums where this is how you have a conversation with your political spokesperson. In this foundation I'm working now, we have these sort of bilateral meetings where we will try to plant some seeds, but there's no kind of collective collaboration happening, and it's all about interest serving rather than creative problem solving. So I'd be curious if you have more thoughts on that aspect. And in terms of returning the favor, I mean, both for the OECD and the EU, as much as I know of where you are now, I mean, your convening power and the power of the narratives you're creating via your institutional backing, there's a huge potential in that, and we did talk about that at dinner last night as well. Because one of the questions that I maybe profitably raised was whether OECD was still relevant as an institution in these times, and obviously the right question is what does the OECD need to do to re-legitimize themselves in kind of fitting to the problems that we are facing. And I, on the one hand, also taking your point, Bill, there's a risk in going too small, in kind of focusing on the quick wins, the small workshops, the toolkits, because you manage the expectations in the wrong way in terms of what it actually entails to do the actual systems change work. On the other hand, if you reach too far, then you're never going to get going, and you have to create some kind of internal legitimacy, and that often comes via concrete outputs. So how many workshops did you do, or how much take up of a new tool is there, and so on. We faced exactly the same thing when I was at MindLab, and I wonder in both cases whether there's a possibility to work with multiple levels of ambition, so you can still do that while having a sort of a more moonshot type thing on the side. So you're sort of pleasing the organization by doing the business as usual, but you're at the same time either by stealth or by kind of creating the space for it, having a very different trajectory that can really prove the worth of investing more strategically and fundamentally in not just the methods but the mindsets and everything that comes with that approach. So I don't know whether you're already doing that, but I would certainly be keen to hear that perspective.
Right.
And I think that in a way goes for both.
Jasper has challenged you, Mariana. The first challenge is the smaller one, which is that you guys focus on quick wins, so you're not strategic. I'm going to be a bit provocative. So using your language. And second one, the legitimacy question is a big one. OECD, if it's related to OECD, is a big one. What's your response to that?
Thank you, Jasper. I can say on the balance between the quick wins and the real scale at which we should be acting, I could not agree more. It's a super difficult balance to get. Legitimacy, I think it's the right word. Systems innovation is a new approach to many people. As anything that is new, we need to get legitimacy for it. And this community, actually the systems innovation community, is a great legitimacy tool as well. It makes visible the fact that it's not just a few crazy people trying to do things differently. It's based on complexity science. There are a lot of people around the world looking into it. So this community, I think, is great for helping on that legitimacy. How to find the balance between the two, it's still unclear to me, I would say. On the OECD at the broader level, I would say that if we look at the OECD or at any other international organizations, we are more or less in the same situation. Big organizations organized as a reflection of governments in silos. I would say there is no big organization around the world of the type of the OECD or the World Bank or other international organizations that are structured in a way that would allow them to think about complex problems really. And I don't have a response on how do we get those type of organizations to get there. I would love to know more. Yesterday, Indy was talking a lot about change in organizations, and I think he may have some ideas around that. I could say, but maybe just to echo on the importance of narrative and mindsets. I could not agree more on that, and I have as well have the same experience on really talking to people that are at a different at a completely different mindset. On my side, what has helped is the fact of being myself trained as a mainstream economist. So myself not seeing many of the things that I now more or less see thanks to systems innovation, to system thinking. So in that sense, that has helped me, and I would argue as well that a higher role for changing mindsets and for changing narratives could be given in policymaking to cognitive sciences. Cognitive sciences, we really know a lot about how our brain works and how we could eventually be changing the narrative, and we are, in my experience, not using enough that information.
Good. So these are 50 years of experience and wisdom, 250 years here. So yes.
Cool. Yeah, hi there. David Heath from the UK Government Digital Service. I'm a software engineer by background. I've worked there since the early days. Just sort of following on that thread, in hindsight, one of the things that enabled GDS to be successful in effecting a systemic change in the UK government public sector was its communication activities and the way that it had a very effective sort of narrative and also routine open blogging, which just created this sort of dominated the discourse about technology change. And I think GDS kind of invented the word digital. I think before people were talking about IT, and they kind of reframed the discourse around digital and digital transformation. So I guess my question is the news media another part of the system that perhaps we're not paying enough attention to in our systemic change efforts, and perhaps should we be trying to, as you say, create those narratives in some way more effectively?
Okay, I'll take one or two more questions if there are. Right, go ahead.
I think it's very connected to that point actually, but when I heard you speak about the problems you face, in particular the attitude that the finance minister just talked about and the response to that, one of the things I constantly is how do we make learning and the obvious potential failure in complex systems in the real world okay in policy? How can we create a narrative where it's acceptable and expected that we have to learn how to do this because we don't know? That to me seems to be an enormous barrier in our work with policymakers.
So communication and learning. You will start.
Okay, I will take the last one. Okay, I think it's a very attractive question. What I'm missing from your question is a kind of a very buzzword about experimentation.
Yeah.
So, and it happens to be that experimentation, and I'm just going to confront again with Jasper, in the Nordic countries is easy. Okay, because of the institutional setting. Try to do it in the south of Europe or in the east, and it's going to be more difficult. Because the kind of the conditions of the political governments and the society to try something new is a little bit more difficult. So how you create a narrative for creating a safe space for learning? So there is a challenge ahead, and you need to do things in a different way, but you don't know how to do that. Okay, so you will not have the perfect equation to start running these new things tomorrow. So the point is how you can create this kind of safe space to try and prototyping and piloting a small scale, and create not only the learning, but also the relations between actors that were not there before, to create trust and confidence to try something new. Okay, so it's not just the learning, but it's also the relational assets and the different elements that are necessary to put different people together to try something new. So the kind of easy way to escape from the buzzword is using something more raw, that is risk management. How we can mitigate the risks of failing while create a safe space for trying something new under certain conditions, and from that we move to a different scale. So that is a potential mechanism. It's not the perfect answer for everyone, but the point is this is beyond learning what we need to see in order to change. We need to create this kind of trust, confidence, and new relation, and we need to create that space for people to be willing to do that without taking a lot of risk. That's the kind of element about that we need to find.
Good. So it's cognitive plus. Go ahead. So you were talking about these, the emphasizing the cognitive part of it, but it appears that learning is much more than that, cultural, emotional, and creating those linkages and understanding other perspectives. So on two questions that we have, government digital services here in the UK, great point on transformation. Actually, transformation from IT to digital is a big step. This is the way it happened, and a lot of communication which helped. So what are the communication mechanisms, in OECD, in your own project and the work which you do, and also the learning processes?
Yeah, maybe to echo that indeed communication is fundamental, and communication is much less present in policymaking than what I think, and I think we will agree it should be. It's still a nice to have thing if we can, but really we are not trying to use communication efforts. And maybe before reflecting, so the OECD again as a traditional organization, it has numerous channels to communicate. There is social media. We also talk to the media, but still there is much more that could be done in that sense. I think we often forget in policymaking that the reality that we see comes from the stories we have heard, right? It doesn't come from anywhere really. It comes from the stories, and in the transport sector there is a particularly interesting story, because since the 1920s, the way we see cities, for example, has completely changed thanks to automobile industry communication efforts. Very active communication efforts for obvious reasons. They want to sell cars, right? But when we are trying to change, for example, the mindset of what cities should look like today, if we want cities to be sustainable, resilient, and not polluted, for example, then we forget that we need to change that story that has been created over decades right now. There is I often cite a historian that is called Peter Norton that explains this story very, very nicely. And I would say that the role of communication is a high leverage point to change systems, right? And we are not currently using that leverage point as we could.
Thank you. Jesper?
Yeah, I totally agree on that, on those elements around communications. I think there are probably two quite powerful things that I've seen in our work. One is that use of stories of, let's say, real people out there in terms of their experiences, and how that often leads to both collective reference points, but also often helps reframe the issue. So in a way, you need that as to move the premise of where you meet on the issue. So you need those stories, and you can create those in many ways through different media and so on. But we also need the story, the internal story that GDS was very good at doing, which was sharing the process, sharing, working out loud. So we're trying this, we don't know whether we're doing well enough or not, but these are the assumptions we're working from, and so on. And that has given a huge amount of legitimacy, being very transparent, but also in a way walking the talk. So you're saying, well, we are actually experimenting with the practice, and these are the hypotheses we're testing right now, and maybe we will fail, and then we'll learn from it. But being open about that gives a huge amount of legitimacy. And that sort of leads to the other point about learning, because one of the things I'm curious about in terms of the UK context is whether, that can help create or legitimize learning outputs as a primary objective. Because in a way, governments are being held back by learning not having legitimacy in terms of building new foundations for making decisions and so on. You have to basically finalize the issue or finalize the process often. So learning becomes a secondary thing. And I did a recent work with the Danish authority, and when I asked them, who's kind of running your learning and R&D component, obviously you have all these branches, you're doing interesting work. And it's like, yeah, we have a network meeting once a month. And then I attended that network meeting of project managers. That network meeting was about just updating on your project. So we've said we'll do this, we've done this now, next thing we'll do is this. And then that was the way they communicated. So there was no reflection, there was no, this was really hard, next time we might try something different. Have you guys been any experiences in doing so and so? So that vulnerability of the learning space is not something that's there, and it's culturally that's really hard to create. But I think to your point about the safe spaces, those safe spaces needs that sort of characteristic and infrastructure.
Thank you. I'm coming back to you on this on your question. Yeah. Because this seems to be a successful story now, this transformation from IT to digital, and linking it with communication. Mm-hmm. So who was in charge of that communication? What was done? Was it departmental? Was it BBC? Was it newspapers? You generated something through social media? What was it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess partly people describe that time as an aligning of stars. There was a particular Francis Maude was Minister of the Cabinet Office at the time. He was at the end of his political career, so he was a very senior person with a lot of authority and able to provide a lot of backing and sponsorship for the change effort. But the GDS also had an internal comms team that were very effective. So a lot of the sort of strategy of how that was talked about was an internal team. So under the leadership of Mike Bracken, but there were a team of folks there who did really amazing work. And I was busy writing software at the time, so I wasn't paying much attention to it. But looking back on it, I think that was one of the things that kind of created that sort of force field of discourse in which we could afford to experiment and make the changes quickly that were needed.
I think you made an important point. I think leadership in systems, that's also something which I have never thought in my 20 years of systems practice and doing things is alignment of stars, perhaps. It's a new addition to systems. Good point. I would like to know. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to add something to the learning topic, and I think it's quite interesting when you say talk about safe space, and then it's language again, right? How is safe space actually safe space? And how do you move on from that? And also based on GDS, I was thinking of the example of Taiwan, I think, digital services, and how they've embedded this kind of experimentation into like the structure of, government. So actually, how do you get there? I think it's quite interesting because everyone knows about this like digital transformation, but after that, what happens? Is it like the safe space in that? But then how do you actually embed it as a practice?
Excellent question. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, just coming over from the other workshop, so it's sort of a on-the-beat kind of thing. And what occurs to me in both is translating the question, who's doing the intelligence and who's facilitating the reflection. And there are two components to that. One component is within the organization. As we see organizations in the prevalent paradigms, or mostly manifestations of the idea of competition. So what, if anything that is not competition needs an extra effort to happen, but is, and these are the two components, the intelligence, who to reach out to, not in the term of, oh, that's a competitor, or we have that in the philanthropic field, or all these sort of people who love to save the world for projects, but they're lying down in competition. So, but who's sort of embracing them in that intelligence of, oh, look, you two, you're basically doing the same stuff, why don't we get together? And to what extent that goes towards the direction of the OECD, could a player, an institution like the OECD, sort of being a space to overcome that idea of competition, and just connecting people and providing a space, a safe and nourishing space, and McCann keen to meet. I was like, oh, yeah, you need to talk together, and then something beautiful will grow out of it, instead of becoming an actor in their own right, not sort of just another castle of experience, trying to chase them. We're here to make the world's best place.
Yeah. I think there's a link between the two questions, the way I see it. Who's the big thinker, who's thinking beyond their own silos or systems, or integrator, how to ensure interoperability in those systems which are there. So quick ones, your take, Jesper, as a company.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more on that description. I think that's the role of government, that's system stewardship. And I think what it best requires is an abandonment of kind of formal targets around, we have to get so and so many in jobs by X amount of years, to say, well, what are the kinds of solution concepts that seems to be working for everyone? What are the principles that are involved in that? And let's use that as a frame of stewarding, different organizations doing similar things to support them, whether it's individually or collectively. So that for me is the missing component.
I may say that if I can ask him who should connect the dots, it might be a secondary question. Is that actually, I can even quote the OECD have, for example, the innovation facets logic, and they are promoting this anticipatory governance on innovation portfolios. Just that they released the Cora Foundation about talking about innovation portfolios. UNDP is using that. Even many parts of the European Commission is using the innovation portfolio, but the industry is using innovation portfolio. So that's kind of the approach that allows you to have people that do that. But if you do not have this idea about that you can have systemic change by connecting the dots, then it's very difficult to justify the role of someone connecting the dots. Okay? So I think the kind of the critical point is that where's the leadership on bringing innovation portfolio comes from. And I may say that maybe not always from the government. Mm-hmm. If you just consider the territorial aspects, are regions that are more leading by industry. So are we going to be neglecting this leadership when they can have this transformative power? And the government can be a facilitator, but not a leader. And what happens when we need to do something portfolio on social innovation, on social aspects, and the government is weak, but there are other organizations that can take a lead. So I think there is an element here about the leadership, but in terms of the implementation, but the conceptualization about connecting the dots needs to have from a different picture. And there are many different things that are going on portfolio. It might be the new fancy way to connect the dots, but it's something that is implemented very widely.
Mariana, last word.
Yeah. I mean, I will echo the conceptualization of connecting the dots, and I think we go back to the mindset issue. When we are able to see systems, we see elements and interconnections between the elements. When we're not able to see systems, we just see elements. And I think that in most of the spaces we have right now in governments, in international organizations, we are seeing elements. So to me, the mindset towards being able to see the interrelations is a first step to be able to design better spaces. And I'm really start having more interesting discussions in that sense.
Well, thank you very much. It's about time for us to conclude this session. And we had a very rich exchange of thoughts and ideas, and I don't want to be late. But just to say that I have learned a lot. Hopefully, when you reflect on this particular session, you think this was time well spent. So a big round of applause for all of us.